The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and dust across the Nebraska frontier, rattling the loose boards of Sarah Mackenzie's cabin like skeletal fingers. She stood at the window, watching the sun bleed red across the horizon, painting the grasslands in shades of copper and rust. It had been 3 months since they'd lowered Thomas into the hard earth behind the chapel in town. 3 months since she'd become another widow in a land that collected them like tumbleweeds. At 24, Sarah was too young to wear black forever. The townswomen said, too pretty to waste away in that cabin at the edge of nowhere. But they didn't understand. The cabin wasn't a prison. It was all she had left of Thomas, of the dreams they'd carried west in their wagon, of the life they'd planned to build with their own hands. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the window. The vastness of the prairie stretched endlessly before her, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods along Willow Creek. Sometimes she felt like the last person alive in the world, especially when the coyotes began their evening chorus and the shadows grew long and strange. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Sarah sipped it anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. She'd stopped bothering with proper meals weeks ago. What was the point of cooking for one? The cornbread went stale, the beans grew cold, and the silence at the table pressed against her ears until she wanted to scream. A movement in the grass caught her eye. Sarah leaned closer to the window, squinting into the dying light. Nothing, just the wind bending the prairie grass, creating waves like a golden ocean. But lately, she'd felt eyes on her. It was foolish, she knew, the kind of fancy that came from too much solitude. Still, sometimes, when she collected water from the well or fed the chickens, the hair on her neck would rise, and she'd spin around to find only empty land staring back. The nearest neighbor, old Walter Hutchins, lived 2 miles east. The town of Clearwater sat 5 miles west, close enough to reach in an emergency, far enough to feel like another world. Thomas had chosen this spot deliberately, away from the judgment and restrictions of town life. "We'll build our own paradise," he'd promised, his eyes bright with fever dreams that turned out to be actual fever. Sarah moved away from the window and lit the oil lamp, chasing shadows into the corners of the single room. The cabin was small but sturdy. Thomas had been particular about that. Good timber walls, a proper stone fireplace, a real glass window that had cost them dear. The bed stood against the far wall, still made for 2, though only one side showed the wrinkles of sleep. His rifle hung above the door, loaded and ready, just as he'd taught her. She'd thought about moving back to town, taking a room at Mrs. Garrett's boarding house, maybe finding work at the general store. But something held her here. Pride, perhaps, or stubbornness, or the simple fact that leaving would mean admitting Thomas was really gone, that their dream had died with him in that bed while she held his burning hand and whispered lies about tomorrow. The fire needed tending. Sarah knelt before the hearth, adding a log to the dying flames. The wood was getting low, another chore she'd need to handle alone. Thomas had always split the wood while she gathered kindling. Now she did both, her hands growing rough and capable in ways her mother back in Ohio would have mourned. As she poked at the fire, Sarah heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the prairie night, not the yip of coyotes or the rustle of wind through grass. This was deliberate, measured. Footsteps. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the rifle. Thomas had taught her to shoot, made her practice until she could hit a tin can at 50 yards. But her hands shook now as she lifted the heavy weapon, checking that it was loaded, cocked, ready. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and purposeful, too heavy for a coyote, too confident for a vagrant. Sarah pressed her back against the wall beside the window, rifle raised, trying to peer out without showing herself. Nothing, just darkness and wind, but the footsteps continued, and now she could hear breathing, deep, steady breathing that seemed to come from a chest far larger than any normal man's. The boards of the porch creaked under immense weight. "Who's there?" Sarah called, proud that her voice came out steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I'm armed, and I know how to use it." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Sarah counted her heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. Then, just as she began to think she'd imagined it all, a shadow passed by the window. Massive, impossibly tall. She glimpsed it for only a moment, a silhouette that blocked out the stars, broader than any man she'd ever seen. Then it was gone, melting back into the prairie darkness as if it had never been. Sarah stayed pressed against the wall until her legs cramped and her arms ached from holding the rifle. Only when the first pale light of dawn crept across the floor did she finally lower the weapon and sink into Thomas's chair by the fire. That's when she heard the talk in town, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the general store, worried glances between the women at the well. There were stories of a giant Apache warrior seen in these parts, a man who stood 7 feet tall and moved like a shadow despite his size. Some said he was a ghost. Others claimed he was real as rain, a warrior separated from his people, haunting the borderlands between the white settlements and the tribal territories. Folks say he's been watching the homesteads. Mrs. Garrett had murmured to her sister, not knowing Sarah could hear. Looking for something, or someone. Sarah had gathered her supplies quickly that day, ignoring the sympathetic looks that followed her. Let them think she was another hysterical widow, jumping at shadows. But she knew what she'd seen, what she'd felt. That night, she moved Thomas's chair to face the door and sat with the rifle across her lap, fighting sleep. The giant didn't return, but she felt his presence like a weight in the air, watching, waiting. For what? She couldn't say. But as the lonely days stretched into lonelier nights, as the prairie wind whispered secrets she couldn't understand, Sarah began to realize that her solitude had taken a different shape. She was alone, yes, but she was no longer unobserved. The giant Apache was out there, somewhere in the vast darkness, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, he had chosen to watch over her, or watch her. The distinction mattered less with each passing day. What mattered was the strange comfort she found in knowing those inhuman footsteps would return, that someone, something, found her worth watching in this empty land. It was a dangerous thought for a widow to have, but danger, Sarah was learning, was better than the suffocating weight of being forgotten, of disappearing into the prairie grass like she'd never existed at all. The coffee grew cold again in her cup. The fire burned low, and somewhere out there in the darkness, she knew, the giant walked his mysterious path, drawn to her cabin by forces neither of them yet understood. The storm came without warning on a November night, rolling across the prairie like the wrath of God himself. Sarah had seen bad weather before. Thomas had held her through plenty of thunderstorms. But this was different. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed, slamming into the cabin walls with enough force to make the timbers groan. She'd secured the shutters and brought the chickens into the small lean-to attached to the cabin, but still the storm raged harder. Lightning split the sky in jagged white tears, illuminating the grassland in stark, terrifying flashes. In those brief moments of brilliance, the familiar landscape transformed into something alien, a writhing sea of grass and shadow. Sarah huddled near the fireplace, feeding it steadily to keep the cold at bay. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and now sleet mixed with rain hammered against the roof like gunshot. She pulled Thomas's old coat around her shoulders, breathing in the fading scent of tobacco and hard work that still clung to the wool. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud she felt it in her chest. The oil lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah had just risen to check the door bolt when lightning blazed again, and in that instant of white fire, she saw him. He stood perhaps 20 feet from her window, motionless despite the gale that bent the grass flat around him. The giant, even through the rain-streaked glass, even in that split second of illumination. His size defied belief. He towered above the storm like some ancient god, rain streaming down a face carved from dark stone. Sarah's scream died in her throat as darkness reclaimed the world. She pressed against the window, waiting for the next flash, her breath fogging the cold glass. When it came, the space where he'd stood was empty, Only the thrashing grass remained. But she knew he was still there. She could feel him the way animals sense predators, a primitive awareness that raised every hair on her body. The storm suddenly seemed less threatening than whatever waited outside her door. Another lightning strike, closer this time. The thunder followed instantly, shaking dust from the rafters. And there, movement by the well, a shadow too large, too solid to be windborne. He was circling the cabin, she realized, checking her defenses, or simply watching, as he'd done for weeks now. Sarah grabbed the rifle, though her hands shook so badly she doubted she could hit the broadside of a barn. What good would bullets do against something that stood untouched in a storm that bent trees double? The wind suddenly died, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had slammed a door on it. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the howling had been. Rain still fell, but gently now, pattering against the roof like nervous fingers. Then came the knock. 3 measured raps on her door, loud enough to echo through the cabin. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. In all his weeks of watching, he'd never approached the door, never made his presence so deliberately known. She stood frozen, rifle clutched to her chest, as the knocks came again, patient, unhurried, as if he knew she had nowhere to run. "What do you want?" The words came out as a whisper. She cleared her throat. Tried again. "I said, what do you want?" No answer, just the soft patter of rain and her own ragged breathing. Sarah crept to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Nothing. But she could feel him there, waiting on the other side of those 2 inches of oak. The presence was overwhelming, like standing next to a mountain. Lightning flashed again, and she glimpsed his shadow through the gap beneath the door. Bare feet, impossibly large, planted firm on her porch boards. He wasn't even seeking shelter from the rain. "Please," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Just go away." A sound came then, not quite a laugh, but something like it, deep as thunder, brief as breath. Then those massive feet turned and moved away, each step making the porch boards cry out in protest. Sarah stayed pressed against the door until her legs cramped. Only when she was certain he'd gone did she dare peek through the window. The storm was already moving on, grumbling its way east across the prairie. Stars began to appear through the breaking clouds. That's when she saw what he'd left. On her porch, placed precisely where she couldn't miss it, sat a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, then grabbed a poker from the fireplace and used it to drag the bundle inside, slamming the door behind it. Inside the waterproof wrapping lay fresh venison, already cleaned and cut, enough meat to last her 2 weeks if she was careful. Beneath it, wrapped separately, were herbs she didn't recognize, dried leaves and roots that smelled of earth and rain. Sarah sank into her chair, staring at the offering. The meat was expertly butchered, the cuts precise. This wasn't the work of some savage. As the town folks claimed, this was skilled, careful, deliberate. But why? What did he want from her? She stored the meat in her cold cellar, hanging it properly to keep. The herbs she left on the table, unsure what to do with them. That night, sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of giants walking through storms, untouched by lightning, unmoved by wind. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Sarah ventured out to check for storm damage, rifle in hand as always. The chicken coop had held, though the birds seemed nervous. Clustered in the far corner, a few shingles had blown off the cabin roof, another repair to add to her endless list. That's when she found the footprints. They circled her cabin completely, pressed deep into the rain-softened earth. Each print was nearly twice the length of her own foot, the stride so long she had to take 3 steps to match one of his. But it was the pattern that made her breath catch. He hadn't just circled randomly. The tracks showed where he'd stopped to brace her loose shutters, where he'd shifted a water barrel to block the wind from her chicken coop door. He'd spent the storm not sheltering but protecting. Her cabin, her animals, her. Sarah followed the tracks to where they led away. toward the creek and the cottonwoods beyond. She stood there a long moment, wind